Hey, and welcome back to Money for Life. My name is Kaylee Roberge, and I'm usually your co-host, but today we have another guest joining us, and I'm super excited because we're diving into college planning with a recognized expert on that topic. Jack Wang joined Eric on this episode to walk you through how to pick your perfect college, reduce how much a college education costs, and maximize what financial aid is available to you. So Jack has helped hundreds of families and students, including his own two children, understand financial aid, student loan options, and payment strategies in the context of overall family finances and retirement plans. And Jack has some really unique insights from his meetings with college admissions and financial aid directors across the country. And he explains how and why every institution approaches aid differently. Knowing that can help your family gain more leverage over the college selection and funding process. So together, Eric and Jack today are also going to cover the importance of starting college planning in the freshman year of high school, not junior or senior year, as I did when I was going through. Jack is also going to share the critical difference between maximizing aid and optimizing how you pay for college, and why flexible saving strategies are often going to outperform just a traditional 529 plan by itself. So whether you're a high-income earner wondering if you'll qualify for any aid at all, or a parent just beginning to think about college costs, this episode provides actionable strategies to help you play the college financial aid game and come out on top. So without further ado, I am going to kick it over to Eric and Jack.
Hey, Jack, welcome to the show.
Eric, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate being here.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this topic in particular because so many of our clients have young kids. They make a lot of money. They don't know how to think about saving for college. You know, we get these extremes like, well, I'm going to throw all the money I possibly can at it because whatever college they get into, I want to pay for it, to, well, I didn't really get much from my parents and I turned out okay. So my kid should just struggle through whatever they need to do to get through it as well. And I know there's so much variability in like what you should do, what you shouldn't do, how to game the system. And just, I want to get down to the facts from someone who really knows. And it sounds like you actually know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I've been doing this for a while. And I work with families all over the country, but also as part of what I do, I also will visit colleges when I travel. And when I visit colleges, people talk about, oh, you went on the college tour and I saw the dorm, saw the classroom, no big deal. But yes, I will do that. But I also will have meetings with the director of admissions and the director of financial aid or their staffs to try and understand how they implement different aid policies. I visit probably 10, 15, 20 schools a year, just depending on my schedule. And I can just basically tell you that everybody does something different. People tend to think about this when they go through this, like, oh, the numbers say this or the whatever formula says that. And I'm like, yeah, that's not even close to being true. Everybody does something different.
That's fascinating. I mean, this is like the Warren Buffett of college planning here. Like you're getting insider information and it's legal to use. That's great.
Yeah. Every time I go into the meetings with the directors of admissions or financial aid, I have to tell them first and acknowledge that I'll say something like, listen, I know I'm basically asking for the secret recipe to Coca-Cola or like KFC. And I don't out anybody unless the schools themselves have publicly disclosed something. But I ask them to tell me, and at first, usually they're kind of hesitant, but once they understand who I am and actually talk the talk, and I'm actually part of their world, or I understand their world really well, they tend to open up. That's when I hear all the secrets. Now, there's still a lot that they don't tell me, right? They'll say, well, we do this for these students and we do that for these other students, but they don't necessarily tell me where that line is drawn, but they will tell me that they kind of run it differently. And so I will hear these things. And it's really fascinating because kind of like any business, they kind of view it through their own lens, their own values, their own objectives. And so it's really creative, some of the things that they've come up with to use the numbers, right? They'll use the numbers, but everybody, I guess, has a slightly different interpretation about it.
Sure. I'd love to get into how to optimize things for kids as parents start to think about this stuff. But before we do that, I'm just curious, what made you dive head on into this? I mean, you are the first person that I have talked to that says they visit colleges to get that information to help people plan for college.
Yeah, and actually on top of that, I'm part of the association for the financial aid people here for all the Massachusetts colleges and universities. So I see them there as well. So I have a lot of friends who actually work for colleges. I got into this originally really for personal needs. I think for, a lot of people, either in our industry or in other industries, like, how'd you decide to sell this? Right. So in my personal situation was that I was getting divorced. And my kids at the time were junior high age. Their mother had been through a divorce previously. So she was kind of used to how divorce agreements are typically structured, and divorce agreements still don't say that much about colleges typically. So she wanted to do something more because obviously, the expectation was for our sons to go to college. So I was going through that process, and just out of sheer coincidence, I was playing in a men's baseball league at the time. And one of my teammates was then a financial aid administrator for a local, extremely well-known college. If I say the name, everybody and their dog would know. And so in between innings, I'm literally peppering him with questions like, how does this work? And how does that work? And he was very generous. And we're still really good friends today. He's since moved on. He's now a consultant for the colleges themselves versus working at a specific college. But he was generous with his knowledge. And I realized, wow, this is actually kind of complicated, right? And if I need to know, then I'm sure other people need to know. So I start to go down this proverbial rabbit hole. And that's really how I got started. And so I'm deep into this rabbit hole. And I love it. I enjoy doing it. I love helping families. I love visiting the colleges. It's also kind of keeps me young, right? I deal with young people and visiting colleges. I just love doing it. But that's how it started. I had to figure it out for myself.
Got it. When you're working with a couple and their kids, or a single person and their kids, what are you doing for them?
Yep. So the vast majority of my clients tend to be what we call late stage planners. And so I don't necessarily mean waiting till the last minute, although in many cases it actually does mean that. But their kids are in high school or approaching high school, right? And to where the specifics of how financial aid works, the specifics of what colleges look for and how they interpret the data, those become much more relevant to the family with the high school student versus the family with like a 5-year-old, right? Because the 5-year-old is still far away. So what I really do is I ultimately help families answer 2 questions. Number 1 is how to maximize aid so you can bring down the cost of college. And when I say aid, I mean like scholarships, financial aid, but there's also other costs involved. So like a lot of what I do also involves tax strategies. Okay, but that's one question I answer first. The second question that I help families answer, and this really has to be done simultaneously, is what is the best way to actually pay for it, right? And so a lot of times people think, well, I'm just going to pay for it, monthly payment or use savings or whatever, or borrow. And those are fine, but there can also be a lot of advanced strategies that can work, which then help offset or save on the cost of the college itself. And so if you think about when people buy a car, right, that's a pretty common financial decision. It's very similar because first when you're buying a car, you have to think about, well, do I want to buy this car? And do I want to buy it for this price, or do I want to try to negotiate more, go to a different dealership? That's the first question. I just happen to do it for college. The second question is, if you think about buying a car, people often say like, well, should you pay cash? Should you borrow? Or should you lease it? Right? That is the how to pay for it question. Again, people answer this stuff all the time. Anything we buy, you have to answer these same 2 questions. I just apply them in the college context.
Okay. That's interesting that people tend to think that there's just one answer, right? Like I got to get it right. There's the college that either they think is the best for their kids, or their kids say that they want to go to, and they want to then support their kids to go to that particular college. But you're saying that there's a lot more strategy, even at the later rounds, right? The later innings before you get to college. There's a lot of planning that can be done to get the right college for your kids.
Right. And I would say this, and this is also true for younger families. I mean, definitely true for the families with like high school students, but still true for parents with younger kids. And that is, what does saving and paying for college even mean? And what I mean by that is, so this is pre-COVID, when back in the day when I used to like meet people at their houses and stuff, or we meet at a coffee shop, I used to do this exercise with the parents, and I would ask them a series of questions and I have them write down the answers on like a piece of paper, but they couldn't look at each other's answers. The bottom line to that is, if you ask parents like, hey, do you want to help your kid pay for college, or do you want to save for college? Probably in your world, just like mine, 99.9% of the time, you're going to get the answer yes. Yes, I want to save for college. I want to help my kid. But what they actually mean by that can be very different. So it's very common for one parent to say something like, well, I went to public school, like I went to University of Massachusetts and I had to work my way. My parents only paid half. So I had to work my way, get scholarships and take out loans to cover the other half. Okay. Well, today, University of Massachusetts in-state is about $35,000 all in. So if you think about 50% of that, it's about $17,000, $18,000. But then the other parent will say, no, my parents, wanted me to go to a school of my choice and they didn't want to burden me. So my parents paid 100% of a private school. Well, the most expensive private college in the country today is Wellesley College, and their sticker price is just over $100,000.
Wow.
Right? So if you think about that from a planning perspective, you have to figure out sort of what are you aiming at? Are you aiming at $17,000 a year times 4? Or are you aiming at $100,000 a year times 4? Those are really different numbers.
Hugely different numbers. I mean, it's like you're listening to my client conversations, because that's exactly what shows up a lot of times is one has this experience, one has that experience. How do we put them together to make sure that they both feel good about the support they're giving?
Yeah, exactly. And so I can tell you in all the years I've been doing this, and I've been doing this over 15 years, I can count the number of times on one hand, the number of times where both parents have actually agreed, right? I've talked to thousands of families on one hand, the number of times where the parents agreed, because everybody's upbringing is a little bit different, right? So they have different values about this stuff. And even if their parents did the same thing for them, the parents today may have different views. Like some may say, no, I really want to help my kid cover everything versus, hey, I really want my kid to have a stake in the game, right?
Sure.
And neither answer is wrong. It's just different. So one of the first things parents need to figure out is what they actually mean by that.
Sure. That's so true. And the fact that, some people like to say, well, let's cover 100% of a state school, and then anything above that, the child would be responsible for, which seems to be reasonable, even if the state school now is $35,000 a year and not, 20, 15 as it used to be.
Let me touch upon that. I'm glad you brought that up because there are actually a lot of rules of thumb that I hear from other advisors, from parents, whatever. And one of them being the parents say, hey, we'll cover 100% of state school. Anything else above and beyond that's on the kid. Sounds logical, right? Sounds very reasonable, very logical, has exactly zero basis in reality. Your kid cannot cover the extras unless something extraordinary happens with scholarships and stuff. But the students themselves cannot borrow. At a minimum, they're going to need a cosigner, which means the parents are actually on the hook for the money, right? Because as cosigners, you are legally responsible for it. And so there are several of these sort of rules of thumb or sayings that often get tossed around that on the surface sound great, but have no hopes of working in the real world. The other phrase I hear all the time is, hey, you can borrow for college, but you can't for retirement. Same type of thing. I hear that a ton. Technically true, but gives a false sense of how the system works. Because again, parents are the ones that have to borrow. And so that's going to impact their retirement. I have plenty of examples of that. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act has now put on much lower loan limits for parents to borrow, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level. So one of the common things that I hear often is parents will say, I'm going to help my kid with undergrad, but graduate's on their own. But now, because of the new rules as a result of those passage of the law, that's also no longer true. The students can't borrow what they needed for graduate school. So the parents are going to have to be involved. So now the planning used to be, well, I'm going to pay for 4 years of undergrad. Now it's going to be like, no, you're paying for 4 years undergrad, plus you're helping out with the 3 years of law school or however many years medical school is or vet school or whatever, right? Now you got to plan for all that stuff too that people weren't thinking about as recently as a year ago.
Let's dig into the financial aid aspect of this thing then, because what I want to ask you right now, and then I want to zoom back out a little bit and look at bigger picture financial aid reality, is how does a student get access to loans, period?
By just simply filling out the FAFSA. Again, it doesn't matter if your annual income is $10,000 a year or $10 million a year, but by virtue of filling out the FAFSA, your student becomes eligible to take out federal student loans, and the parents can take out federal student loans subject to a limit. But the loans that the students can take out themselves the amounts are quite small. So for example, for freshman year, it's only $5,500. And that is it. Now, the loan is to the student. The parents are not co-signers. So if the student doesn't pay down the road, the parents are not responsible. a really low interest rate fixed, it's a really good loan as loans go, but it's such a limited amount. But the student can borrow that just by simply filling out the FAFSA.
And that's $5,500 per semester or per year?
That's $5,500 per year. Sophomore year goes up to $6,500. Then it's $7,500 and $7,500 again, junior and senior year. So for an aggregate total of $27,000. So the stories of, oh, my kid graduated with $400,000 debt does not come from this, right? You can't turn 27 grand into like 400 in like a couple of years' time. Where those student loan stories came from were actually at the graduate level. So at the graduate level, by virtue of filling out the FAFSA, the rule used to be that students could borrow as much as they needed, $50,000 a year, $90,000 a year, $100,000 a year to pay for graduate school. So that's where the I graduated $400,000 of that stories come from. Parents can also borrow using federal loans. It used to be parents could borrow as much as they needed for college with basically no credit check, right? Your credit score didn't matter. Having income didn't matter, right? You could be jobless with like a 400 credit score and you could still borrow 90 grand a year if you needed to. That's not true anymore. Again, as a result of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, at the undergraduate level, parents are now limited to $20,000 per year, $65,000 aggregate limit per student. So that means if you borrow 20 a year, you're done after 3 years. Wow. Still no credit check, but now it's a substantial limit. And there's no equivalent at the graduate level. There never was. So at the graduate level, students can borrow, but now the amounts are limited. And that's why parents may have to co-sign for like private loans or do like a home equity loan or something like that.
Got it. So in that case, then it's from the public side, the federal side, it's a max of $65,000 plus $27,000 really for both combined parents and students. So just over $100,000 of loans federally.
Yeah, a little bit less than 100 grand, but yeah, yes.
Got it. Okay. That's interesting. People should really know that, right? Because like you said, expectations are really important here. And if you expect that you're going to be able to use loans to fill in the difference, and that difference is over that amount, you're mistaken.
Right. And then since we're talking about at the graduate level, it used to be that students could borrow as much as they needed. But now under the new law, graduate schools are now categorized into two categories. They always were, but it never mattered. Now it matters. So graduate schools are split between what we call graduate programs versus professional programs. So professional programs being medical, dental, vet, law, chiropractic, certain clergy, things like that. And then everything else, like in an MBA or master's in social work, whatever, is what we call now graduate programs. So for graduate programs, the loan limit is now $20,500 per year with a $100,000 lifetime limit. And then for professional schools, it's going to be $50,000 a year with a $200,000 lifetime limit. Now, I don't know how the last time you may have looked at this, but I know a lot of law schools, and a lot of medical schools, and a lot of dental schools, a lot of vet schools that cost way more than 50 grand a year.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So it's going to have a huge impact on not only finances, but also these schools and where students go and things like that, obviously.
All right. So that's the federal loan side anyway. I don't think we need to dig in too much into the private at this stage of the conversation anyway. But if we look at financial aid, what would you say is the most surprising thing that you know about financial aid? And this is really speaking to that person who thinks they make too much money for financial aid.
I think one of the most common misconceptions that people have is that the numbers are the numbers. Because I get asked questions all the time, like, does this count? Does that count? How do colleges treat like that asset or treat that income? Or is it better to have the money in the kid's name versus the parent's name or vice versa? And people think like, well, the numbers are the numbers and it calculates out to whether you're going to qualify for aid on paper or not. The reality is the numbers are just a guideline. So the way that aid works, right? When you look at a particular student and they get aid in whatever form it is, sometimes from the federal government beyond the loans. So things like Pell Grant and stuff like that, which is for low income families. So there's potentially some money from the federal government. The bulk of the money actually comes from what we call institutional aid, which is the colleges themselves. It's their own money. And then there's like state aid. So here in the state of Massachusetts, there's different programs and stuff like that. So for federal aid and state aid, it's very black and white. The numbers say you either get it or the numbers say you don't, right? And that could be need-based aid, like a Pell Grant at the federal level, or it could be more merit aid, for example, like the John and Abigail Adams Scholarship here in Massachusetts, or like a Bright Future Scholarship in the state of Florida. Those are based on academics, but those are state programs. You either qualify or you don't, period. But the bulk of the money is sort of in this middle category where I called institutional aid. And because it's the college's own money, they get to set the rules. And so as a result, aid is just aid. So a lot of parents think like, well, merit scholarships based on grades and test scores or the application, financial aid is based on the numbers. The reality is there's a very fuzzy line in between two. Merit aid can have a financial aid component and financial aid can have a merit component, and they often do. But the schools get to decide that. So a lot of families are sort of focused on what the numbers say and like, oh, I qualify for this, I don't qualify for that. And when their kid applies, they find out that they didn't get it or they got more than they expected. And that's because colleges use the FAFSA or financial aid data as a guideline, but they don't have to stick to it. In fact, I have many examples of where colleges can tweak those guidelines or tweak the calculations to sort of to serve their own purposes. So families think one thing, the colleges think something else totally. But the biggest thing to remember is that it's their own money. They get to set the rules, and different colleges set very different rules about this.
Interesting. So you're saying, one, just because you make a certain amount of money, don't assume that you're not eligible for financial aid because the college gets to decide who gets it and who doesn't, regardless of income per se, right?
Correct.
You should always, it sounds like, always fill out the FAFSA form.
Right. And I tell even my millionaire clients that you should always fill out the FAFSA form for a couple reasons. Number one, as we discussed, by filling out the FAFSA form, you get access to the loans. And the loans can actually be a really great strategy. I've had parents say back to me, but we already have the money saved. We don't need it. It's like, yeah, but the loans actually can work out better because especially to the student, right? They're really low interest rate loans. So if you think about if you can use someone else's money at a really low interest rate, that allows your own money to continue to grow, right? Because you didn't spend it. You're using other people's money. So loans can be a really effective strategy. The second reason I tell families fill out the FAFSA is if you don't fill out the FAFSA or for some schools use a second financial aid form called the CSS. If you don't fill this out, what you're telling the school is you don't need the money. Right. And colleges will thank you for this, right? Like if you tell them you don't need the money, essentially we're telling them you're willing to pay full sticker price. They'll take that all day long, then some, right? It's kind of like walking onto like a car dealership and just saying, look, I'll just pay the price on the sticker. We don't need to hassle. They'll take you, right? Everybody will take you for that. The other thing is there are schools around the country where even merit scholarships are dependent on the FAFSA. Obviously, your grades don't go on the financial aid form. But again, if you don't fill out the FAFSA, what you're doing is you're telling the school you don't need the money. And so there are a number of cases where even your kid has, straight A's, highest SAT scores, blah, 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 all that stuff. They still wouldn't get that merit scholarship simply because you didn't fill out the FAFSA. That can and does happen.
Got it. Okay. So if your goal is to pay full sticker price, then best choice is don't fill out FAFSA form.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But I would say this, if as a family, if your goal is to just pay full sticker, we probably should have a different conversation.
Yeah. Well, so like in that realm then, of the people who submit FAFSA forms, how many pay full sticker price?
That's a great question. This is data that is public, but not a lot of parents think about this, and almost no parents ask about this. If you look at the entirety of the United States, there's about 3,000 plus colleges and universities, right? That ranges from community colleges to trade schools, even to private and public four-year universities, and then some. In the landscape, I'll describe it this way. I think it's called the Pareto rule. I think that's the name. And that's like the 80-20 rule, if people are familiar, right? Like 20% of your clients bring in 80% of your revenue, or 20% of your whatever, take 80% of the work, right? In almost every situation. So there's very much an 80-20 rule in college. And I would say it's more like 90-10. So what I mean by this is the top 10% of colleges in the United States. So this would be your Ivy Leagues, your near Ivy Leagues, or your other big national brands, the names that everybody would know no matter where you're from. That 10%-ish of colleges actually gets around 90% of all high school applications because everybody wants to go to the Harvards, the Stanfords, MITs, Northwesterns, blah, 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 right? Everybody knows those names. So for those schools, if you look at what percentage of students pay full sticker, it's typically, from the data that I've seen, it's about a third or more. So for example, there's one very well-known university, well, I suppose I can say the name because it is public data, but you look at Boston University, right? Boston University is about 95 grand. Over 50% of students every year pay full sticker.
Wow.
Now, sometimes that's because the family's super wealthy, right? And they have the money, and that's okay. But for a lot of these schools, the families aren't always super wealthy, but if the kid got into BU or Harvard or Stanford or whatever, but for full sticker, most parents I talk to would be like, I will borrow to make that work, right? Because it is Stanford or Berkeley or Northwestern or whatever, okay? Because they're paying for the name. There's a perceived value. So at those schools, third to over 50% pay full sticker. Now you look at the other 90% of colleges out there. These are still fantastic schools in their own right, but they're maybe more regionally known. But because now the other 90% of colleges are fighting over the remaining 10% of applications, it becomes more of a price game. So there are colleges where no student pays full sticker or very low percentage. So it almost becomes, if, and I know your podcast goes to, people all over the country, but if you're familiar with the department store Kohl's, right? Yep. Kohl's runs sales or they send out coupons or whatever all the time. And so I kind of compare it to Kohl's. Like if you shop at Kohl's and you pay regular price, you've done something wrong. Okay. And don't get me wrong, I love Kohl's. I do buy stuff there. I do shop there, right? So nothing against them, but it's their business model, right? Like everybody gets a coupon or whatever, or everything's on sale at some point. So yeah, you basically never pay full price at Kohl's for anything because of the way they run their business. And so these other 90% colleges, it's kind of like that. Like most kids, if not all of them, will get some sort of aid.
Huh. Well, that sounds interesting. I mean, for those people who don't require the top 10% just because, how do you sort through the other 90%? Because that's a lot of colleges, right? Like, how do you even figure out where to go next when it comes to the application or the visiting of campuses with kids?
I compare it to buying a house. So a lot of kids, the way they look at it, and a lot of parents look at this, especially if they're focused on that top 10%, it would be like saying, like, I have to live in this town, but I don't care what size of the house is, right? So like they're focused on like, I have to live in this town or city, even if my family of 5 squeezes into a studio apartment. Okay. That's how families really think about this. But most of us, when we buy houses or look for housing, we look for the house. Yeah, we might narrow down to like a couple towns, but like, I'm not going to squeeze a family of 5 into a studio apartment. So if you think about when you're buying a house, you not only look at the house itself, like how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, whatever, but you're looking at the surrounding community. What's the rest of town like? What's my commute to work can be like, and things like that. And so one of the ways that I think is really overlooked by parents and students, they don't put enough emphasis in terms of figuring out like, hey, you might like the college, but do you actually want to live there? One time I had a student tell me, I'm really looking at this Ivy League school, but the Ivy League school was in the middle of a large city downtown. But then the very next sentence, the kid would tell me, I don't want to be in a city. Like, well, those two things can't be true at once, right? You either want the school or you want to not be in a city, but you can't have both in that particular case. So you got to figure that out. The reason it's important for parents, especially from a financial perspective, is because there's a significant chunk of students who transfer each year, not because they flunked out, but because the campus is too big or the campus is too small or too far from home, too close to home, too hot, too cold, hate the food. You wouldn't believe how important college food is now these days, right? And it's actually an important factor. But kids will transfer because they don't like one of these factors. And when they transfer, what happens is they get something called transfer leakage. So it's hey, Eric, you know that math class you took at your last college? Well, that doesn't transfer as a math class at this new college. You have to retake our version of it. Well, when you do that, you lengthen out the time to graduation. And when you lengthen out the time to graduation, it costs the parents more money because instead of going 4 years now, you're going as many as 6 for just the undergrad. So parents really need to kind of spend some time like buying a house. Like, do I actually want to live here? And stuff on campus and off campus and how far it is from home and all that stuff, right? Think of it like buying a house.
So is there a way to sort through that information? Is there a checklist that someone should go through to try to get down to generally what kind of school makes sense, and then take that information and apply that to actual schools to see which ones fit? Like, how does that even happen? It seems overwhelming still.
It is still overwhelming. There are a lot of resources online, some from the Department of Education themselves, others are private, like the College Board website or Niche, or even like a Princeton Review, where you can search and sort. So the way most families approach this is they'll look at like, all right, give me all the colleges that has the major that my kid wants to study, right? Or look at like the U.S. News and World Report, like the top ranking list. Okay, we'll start with the ranking list. Which one of these colleges have the major that my kid wants to study? You can then sort and search and filter. But what I always tell families is, even before you start to do that, go visit a local college. And you can start this younger too. Even if it's a college that your student may not want to go to, or that they may not have the major that your student wants to study, that's okay, because it allows you to see and figure out what elements you like versus what elements you don't like. And now you have a basis for comparison. So you might visit a college that doesn't have your major, but you really like the fact that the dorm room is really close to the dining hall. Okay, no problem. So you're not going to go to that college, no problem. But you know that maybe something like that's really important to you. Now, when you start to narrow down, use some of those tools to narrow down other college lists, you can look for that. You can't really filter. Nobody like has that on a website anywhere, but when you go on these other tours, you can now look for that. Or if you know that you don't like something, or to not look for that, or whatever the case may be, but it gives you a basis now to work from, versus just sort of walking on a college campus first time and just sort of blind and just going, yep. Yeah, seems good. Yeah, and even in the dining halls, there are real differences in the quality of food and how they treat students with allergies. There are some substantial differences. So you might cross a college off the list or put one on the list simply based on the accommodations that they can give your student for any kind of like food allergies.
Oh, wow. I mean, I like the idea of testing. It's almost like training wheels, or just like figuring out like what might make sense, generally speaking, before you start to make decisions. That's something I certainly did not do. I think I went down to Florida to Rollins College, checked it out, said I can wakeboard there on campus. That sounds great. And I chose not to do that because that sounded like a recipe for failing out. Then I went to Providence College and I said, that looks too much like my high school. It looks exactly the same as my high school. I don't want that. And then I went to Babson and said, well, business, it's kind of close to my home. Seems right. Let's go. Right. And the college soccer coach happened to be talking to me. That's the extent of my understanding about what I wanted. So I feel like I would have definitely benefited from something like this, where you're doing the pre-work, understanding generally what you like, and figuring out what schools fit the mold. But then there's the cost, right? We talked about a little bit about financial aid before. We talked about merit aid. How then do you apply that scan to the colleges that might make sense based on the other stuff?
So this is really hard. There's a lot of misconceptions around here. Many of those top 10% of schools are what are called full need met. And what that means is that the college, using the financial aid forms, calculate out what you can afford. If what you can afford is less than what they cost, then that gap. So if a college costs $90,000 a year, but they figure out you can afford 40, the full need met colleges will say, we will give you the difference of the 40. But what people sort of fail to remember is that you're still on the hook for their 50 in that example. So full need met does not always mean that they're generous, but you can ask questions of colleges, like when on these tours, like how many kids get scholarships and whatever, they can tell you. And sometimes parents are sort of fixated on like, yeah, I'll use, again, because this is public, I can talk about it. So Boston College generally does not do scholarships, but they have one scholarship program called the Presidential Scholarship, which is a full ride. So parents are like, my kids has a really, really good student. We're going to try for BC and try and get the Presidential Scholarship. Well, the Presidential Scholarship only goes to 15 students per year out of the 2,700 or so that enroll. So yes, it does exist, but your odds of getting it are infinitesimally small. And even schools that do like scholarships to, let's say, the top 15% of students, but by definition, that means the other 85 don't get anything in terms of merit scholarships anyway. So this is much harder. One of the things that parents can do, a couple things. By law, on every college's website, there's something called a net price calculator. Some are better than others, but the net price calculator is essentially doing the FAFSA as a test run. And you put your information in, and the calculator spit out what an estimated price based on the information you put in. Now, garbage in, garbage out rules still apply, right? So you put in junk, you're going to get junk, but you can get an estimate of what it might be. The other thing is colleges always publish what's called average net price. And net price is the price of the college after what's called gift aid, which is like scholarships and grants. And colleges always publicize one net price. But in reality, colleges have to publish multiple net prices based on income range. So if your income is below this threshold, the average net price is this. So the highest threshold is if your income is over 110,000, which is probably everybody you talk to, right? But you'll see that there's a wide range of net prices. So, and oftentimes schools will publish, our average net price is $20,000 a year. And parents will say that, but they'll say, but the average net price for families with $110,000 income or more is $50,000 a year. Like, oh, but that's public data. You can look that up on like Department of Ed websites, College Scorecard. I don't recall if College Board website has it. So it's called average net price by income. And that is something that you can look up for every college. So a family can start to get an idea of roughly how much this place is going to cost.
That makes sense. So now I want to go in a little bit of a different direction here. And because we talked about financial aid, merit aid, loans, and then there's my child is young and I have plenty of time to save. So let me be proactive and save enough money. Part of it is people think if I save too much money, then that's going to impact me negatively. But then there's also let's put everything in a 529 plan because that's going to be the best tax benefit for me. How do you sort through those two thoughts?
Yep. For younger families, definitely that first conversation that we talked about, like what does saving and paying for college even mean to you? That's absolutely important. Even if you just have a baby. One of the things that parents really want to think about in terms of their finances is sort of the trade-off between saving in a 529 and getting some tax benefits versus saving in a different way. And what I mean a different way could just be a regular like investment account. I mean, it could be a savings account for all I care. But every account has different tax rules and different accessibility rules. So for example, 529s, you can withdraw the money anytime, but if you withdraw for something not related to college or private school education or the other lot of expenses, you're going to pay tax on the earnings plus a potential penalty. Versus if you have money that's in a savings account, you withdraw it for anything. There's no penalty, but you also don't get the tax benefits up front, right? So you have to find that trade-off. So oftentimes what I find is that the money needs to serve double or even triple duty. And what I mean by that is, yes, families want to save it for college, but they also may need it for other things. And especially the younger the child, the more true that tends to become for most families, not always. Because what they find is that, yes, I have 15 years before my kid goes to college, let's say, but in the meantime, I might need access to that money because I might need to buy a car, I might want to buy a second property or take a vacation, or if they don't need it for college, I want to use it to supplement my retirement savings or any other host of reasons. And so depending on how important those things are will dictate sort of where you should put the money, right? So this is not a pro or against 529 conversation. It's just, but you have to balance it out. And it's okay to split, right? Maybe some money in 529, some money elsewhere. It's okay. But I think, in my opinion, working with families, that tends to be a little bit more important, figuring that out first.
I personally have a bias towards flexibility. I'd rather not pay penalties on money that I've saved. So I'd rather give up a little bit of tax benefit potentially and save more money for flexibility purposes.
So and I'm with you. And so I'll give you an example of where it's sort of a family went too far one way. So I work with a family where they have two kids and the parents saved every last penny they had in 529 to where they have hundreds of thousands of dollars in 529. We do our thing. I work with them, and for their older daughter, because of some of the programs the parents had access to, but some other reasons, their daughter ended up not needing the money. Okay. Her college cost was fairly minimal. They have a younger son, but they also have several $100,000 in a 529 for him. So he's all set, but the money that they saved in the daughter's 529 is essentially now stuck, and she's not in a field where she needs to go to grad school. So now the discussion becomes, how can we take money out of the 529 and do so in a way that minimizes taxes and penalties? And there's some really crazy advanced strategies there, but they oversave. Now, pros and cons, right? On one hand, we told them, congratulations, you guys did a great job saving. Like, this is a nice problem to have. It's better than not having any money saved, but you sort of overshot and now we're kind of stuck, right? It has now introduced another problem to where, what do we do with this money?
Yeah. Obviously fewer people are in that category, but it's still a real thing. And people should consider that when they're starting to aggressively save for college when the kids are young.
But I'm with you. I prefer flexibility over tax benefits. But again, everybody's different.
You had mentioned something about gifting to the kids, I believe, to benefit ultimately from a tax perspective.
Right. Most people think about paying for college simply like, okay, I'm going to make monthly payments, because colleges do have monthly payment plans for each given academic year. Monthly payments, just using savings, like I'll take money on my 529 or take money on my savings account, just write the check and just pay it, or borrowing or some combination thereof. The reality is there can actually be a lot more advanced strategies. So disclaimer, I'm not a CPA, I'm not a tax person, talk to your own person for this, but here's kind of an example of conceptually. So let's say you had a bunch of what we call non-qualified investments. So perhaps it was stock that you got from your employer that's now vested, or you just had saved money on your own, just outside of 529, outside of a retirement plan. And your goal was to sell off those investments to pay for college. There's nothing wrong with that. You can certainly do that, but you're also going to pay a lot in taxes potentially when you do that. So if you think about the tax drag, a $90,000 a year college, and remember, college is after taxes, right? We earn our money, we pay our taxes, and then what's left over, we save or pay for college. But on a pre-tax basis, that $90,000 a year college might be $120,000 to $150,000 a year pre-tax, because you're having to earn the money, pay the taxes, then what's left. So if you're going to soft the investment, you're going to pay a tax, and you, the parent, are probably at a higher tax rate than your kid, presumably. So one thing you could do is you could gift those investments, right, in annual chunks to your kid. And this actually works out better the younger your kid is, because you have more time to gift. And then it's in your kid's name. Essentially, you have your kids sell off the investment at their lower tax rate to then pay for college. Now, there's some timing issues and issue dealing with what's called kiddie tax and stuff. The way this typically has to work is you gift over, and then for college, you actually borrow. And then when the kid graduates college, then your kid sells off the investments to then pay off the loans, right? And even if they get a job after college, they're, again, probably not at an income level that corresponds to what the parents are at, right? So the kids are probably still at a lower income tax bracket than the parents would be. So that's an example of gifting. Now, you can go even more advanced than that. And certainly there's even more advanced strategies for high income earners or business owners or self-employed. You can really go pretty creatively on this to save a lot in taxes. And the tax savings can then help pay for college. But again, that's just a simple example of gifting.
That makes sense. I mean, it's kind of similar to like donating appreciated shares to a charity, right? You have the shares, there's unrealized gains. If you sell, you're paying 20% plus 3.8% on that. If you're making, over, $600,000 or more. And then if you give it to the child, their tax rate is a little bit lower, or at least a portion of it is while they're minors. And you're going to benefit from that lower tax bracket. But you're saying even they're not going to sell necessarily. They're going to borrow, and then they'll sell the shares and realize the gains after college instead of before while they're going to school.
Right. And part of the strategy, so one of the things that's in the tax code, it's not a ton of money, but still something, is there's something called the American Opportunity Tax Credit. It's a dollar for dollar tax credit up to $2,500 a year. Well, if your income's beyond a certain level, you lose access to that credit. But by doing some of these types of strategies, you can actually regain access to a portion of that credit through your kid, not you, right? So you at least then have another sort of kicker of getting tax credits to help pay for college. And so you could piece it together to where a decent chunk of college is paid through by tax savings, because you're going to pay the taxes anyway. So would you rather pay the IRS and then have to pay for college, or pay the IRS less and then use those savings to help pay for college?
Sure.
I choose the latter, right? I'm not a fan of paying the IRS any more than I absolutely have to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it's not just like defer income or not, right? There's a lot of different strategies. We always talk about, let's pay the lowest lifetime taxes possible. Let's not just look at like, how much do we save in taxes right now this year? That's kind of fits into that strategy there.
Exactly.
You mentioned some advanced strategies. I would love to have you come back in a future podcast to talk more specifically about advanced strategies for high income earners, for business owners, things like that. But at this stage, I think a lot of information that you've given us is super valuable. If there was one thing, though, that you had to leave the audience with from this conversation, what do you think that would be?
I'm sure you say this to your clients about anything, but the earlier you plan, the earlier you get started, the more options and the better you can do this. And I say that because most families wait until junior year or even senior year before they start thinking about the money. Prior to that, they're thinking about the admission stuff. Oh, I got to study for my SATs, or I got to take these classes, or both. And yes, those are important. I don't want to minimize that. But the money part, especially some of the strategies and maximizing aid, start as early as freshman year of high school, if not a little bit earlier. Whereas families typically don't think about it again until either junior or senior. So you got to do this early if you want to play the game and play the game well. And if you start earlier, then you have time to play the game really well and pay very little for college.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm taking from this is save early and often, keep the savings flexible so it can be used for anything, because you can't be negatively hit if you have a lot of money and you just don't use it for college, if there's no penalties on that money in the end. And then get in earlier than you think, maybe, to start the conversation about what actual college looks like for your child, but do so in a way that they're old enough to start to think about what they might want, right? Going in at 5th grade is probably not going to make sense. But when they're in high school, before junior year, start to think about that with your kids. Is that accurate?
Right. And actually, I'll just kind of say this, and this is true for even younger, not super young families, but like by the time you hit like middle school or something, a lot of parents talk about like extracurriculars and, what clubs and what they might do or for sports or whatever. And if you're aiming at the top schools, that top 10%, then those really have to be aligned with what your intended major is. And I'll use this example. Like if your kid wants to study engineering, but their extracurricular is writing poetry, there's nothing wrong with writing poetry. Okay. Like I'm not saying that at all, but especially when you apply those top schools, they're going to say, okay, well, you want to major in engineering, but you don't do anything engineering related outside of school. So how do we actually know you want to do engineering? And stuff like that can, doesn't always, but can actually have an impact on aid. Because the more aligned you are, the more serious they know you are. If your student has an intended major. Now, not every kid has that. But if you know that, hey, I want to study engineering, then all that other stuff has to be aligned. And so in order to do that, that starts a little bit earlier, right? You can't wait till like senior year to sign up for the engineering club at your high school. You got to start that like 8th grade or freshman year, if not a little bit earlier, to start doing, or even in middle school, there's some activities like STEM related activities that sort of would indicate that you're interested in the area. It starts way earlier than people think is the bottom line.
Yeah, got it. Makes sense. And I know you have a podcast and I think a YouTube channel. Can you just share that information with people if they want to get more from you?
Yeah, so my podcast is called Smart College Buyer. It's available on all the major platforms, Spotify, iHeart, Apple, et cetera, as well as on YouTube. And my podcast is exclusively on all things related to college. So it's how aid works, how loans work, strategies, but also I have guests on to talk about test prep and admissions and finding your major and career path. So anything related to college, that's my podcast. So make sure you look me up and subscribe, if you please. Smart College Buyer.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, this information is super valuable. It's something that people, I think, don't think about enough, but I think they also don't know that they have more ability to form the experience than they do. Right. Like they actually have a lot of access to making it right for their kids if they just start early.
Exactly.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for being here. Hopefully we'll see you again soon.
All right. Thank you, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Money for Life, hosted by Eric Roberge, CFP and founder of Beyond Your Hammock, and me, Kaylee Roberge. Our show is produced and edited by Steve Stewart. If you want to learn more about wealth management and hiring your own personal financial advisor, visit beyondyourhammock.com. And now for the legal stuff. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice, and may not cover all critical, complete details of every situation discussed. The views expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of the host or the podcast. Please consult a qualified professional about your specific situation before making any financial decisions based on this podcast or any other educational content designed for a general audience.